Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, is this Cannupa?
This is Cannupa. How you doing, Paul?
Cannupa, what a pleasure to have you on the call. And Yuval, are you there?
Yes, hello.
I'm on the phone now with Yuval Sharon and Cannupa Hanska Luger, and I'm so delighted that you both could make it. Thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. Maybe very briefly you can tell our listeners where this call finds you, and basically what have you been up to in the last 4 months? Give us a sense of the. I don't know which one of the two of you is laughing, but I think we need certain moments of hilarity in this crazy, delirious, dire, dark times. We need a little bit of laughter. But tell us, where are you? Maybe let's start with Cannupa. Where does this call find you at the present time?
I am sitting on a van seat removed from a van that I have sitting in an exhibition in Santa Fe, where I live just outside of. I'm sitting on my porch, looking out over the mountains here in Glorieta, New Mexico.
I'm there with you. A likely story. And what kind of a van do I find you in, Yuval?
Mine's not quite a van. Mine is my apartment here in Los Angeles, in the neighborhood of Lincoln Heights, just north of downtown. And it's not exactly where I thought I was going to be 4 months ago. I had been planning a year-long sabbatical to Japan to write a book. That was going to be the culmination of not taking vacation for many, many years and realizing I was going to try and do it all in one fail swoop. So those plans got changed, and instead I'm still here in Los Angeles and looking for all of the great things that come along with being here in Los Angeles, of which there are many, even in quarantine.
So let's start with Yuval and what you just said. You were going to be in Japan. Why Japan? And what's the book? And are you writing the book now that you're not in Japan?
I'm trying. Yes, I'm trying. The book is about opera and about a vision for the future of opera, laying that out and talking about it and trying to imagine what that could be. It's something that I've been commissioned by Norton to write, and I was very excited to write it. But quite honestly, I've had to rethink so many of the things I wanted to write about. Certainly, the tone in which I wanted to write. Things have changed so much. And I think it is a moment to think about not just opera, but really all of the arts, and certainly the performing arts. But I think the role that arts the role that arts can play in our culture now, with everything that has changed, and as we are saying goodbye to what was normal and trying to imagine what the future looks like. It's a moment of real change, and I think that it's made me rethink some of the rhetoric that I had been planning around thinking about opera. Well, so I am finding a way. I'm finding a way to chip away at this book, but it's not the same as going away, cutting myself off from my normal routines and distractions and business. And that was the purpose of Japan, really, was to just remove myself from everything that I had normally, everything that I was normally doing, to offer myself some time for reflection and some space for reflection.
Can you say a little bit more about why the tone needs to change, and in a sense also the tone changing, maybe even the very ambition of a future for opera may have changed?
I mean, there's part of me that wants to say, I think looking around at our landscape might make that question somewhat self-evident because the way that we are thinking about all of the old structures and systems of thought and, everything related to how we represent ourselves is undergoing a massive change. And I think that opera is not always thought of in the same way as cinema or literature in terms of what representation means and what it means to posit a future for humanity. But that I think that opera very much plays a role in the shaping of a cultural identity. And in America, in particular in America, I feel like that is something that we haven't fully embraced. We are still looking at opera as a colonialist art form in so many ways. It's still an art form that feels removed from our time and our place. And certainly a big part of my work for the industry and the project that Cannupa and I did together, Sweetland, was about trying to dismantle that in whatever way we could, with the means that we have. But I've been thinking that with everything that's been happening and with calls for real change in our society, I think that opera needs to heed that call in so many ways. And I think what might have felt maybe more like a rhetoric of suggestion now feels like it. I personally feel like it's only obvious to be listening to all of these really drastic calls for change and to be part of that conversation in that way.
Cannupa, how does this, what Yuval just said, resonate in your practice? You were talking about the exhibitions you're having and the van in which you are, and I'm just wondering how how this resonates with you, and if there is also a dismantling and a reckoning that is happening within your own way of thinking.
As a visual artist, you're kind of deep into these institutional spaces as a place for communication to exist, a place for that exchange artist and audience. I don't know when anybody will actually see it. I just came back from Arizona to install a sculpture in a museum. The herd that waiting for society to shift and the conversation to shift is interesting to me because it puts in question, what are these spaces? How important are they as life goes on without them? How do we acclimate to that variation? How does calls across the globe, Zoom calls and online content change the dynamic of this relationship between the institution, which is hyper-colonial, compared to something that's a bit more honest in the exchange between people, which is, talking and having access. So,
right.
As artists, it's really interesting to look at how this dynamic is shifting under the weight of quarantine, under the weight of shelter in place, how we continue to navigate these spaces and how that continued navigation undermines all of the systems that were in play before. What you've all said around opera being a colonial structure.
Well,
I think what we need to remember is that is the idea has been co-opted. Opera has been in play well before it was titled opera. And any ceremony that takes place within cultures around the world is opera. It's many different artists and thinkers coming together to tell a story. That's old. That's very old,
And both of you have used now maybe twice, maybe three times, perhaps four times the word colonization. And it reminded me of a moment I very much liked in another quarantine tape airing with Viet Thanh Nguyen. And he said the following to me, and I'd like you both to respond to it. I'll read this quotation of his. The United States is an example of a completely successful colonization project because the colonists were never defeated. They were never kicked out as the French were in Haiti or the Europeans were in many countries. The white settlers came and they stayed in this country, a successful colonization project. Only we don't call colonization by that name in the United States because it's anathema to how we imagine ourselves. Instead, we call successful colonization the American dream. That's how we make ideological sense of it. And there's no way that we're going to be able to address all the inequities of our society without going back to the roots of this country and colonization. What comes to mind to both of you when you hear this, and maybe you can even place it within the extraordinary opera you did together, Sweetland?
My response to that is it's embedded in the idea of success, success for who, as
Right.
as an indigenous person to the Americas,
Maybe
was
not.
not successful. At what cost does that success come, and to who it pays that balance, And if that balance is much, much greater than the value of the system that was created, then I don't consider that successful. And the cost was far too high to consider it successful in my eyes, and I think as time will tell, in most people's eyes. I mean, America is a young country in relationship to empires, and we're happy to call it success right now because we haven't seen its middle of it. And I think that there needs to be a reckoning and a conversation around that, which I think is important. America has to remember that it is a colonial construct. I think in our efforts with Sweetland, we tried to make a more honest representation of what that exchange was. In school, in public school in the United States, there's, talks of pilgrims and travelers and those displaced from their homelands to come to this place. And they get off the boat well fed and ready to lift themselves by their own bootstraps and create something new. But the truth of that exchange was desperation and hunger and starvation and suffering. And until this country recognizes the suffering that it came with and was aided by the indigenous populations here, we're not going to have an honest conversation. And until we have an honest conversation around that, I don't think it's safe to call this experiment successful.
Wow. And just before Yuval launches into what his response will be, which I'm sure will be quite a response, I'm always heartened to remember the origin of the word remember, which literally means putting the members back together. We need to reconstitute that whole and look at it. You look at it in a very candid and open way, which that reckoning has not yet happened. But this moment in our history, which we're all living together now, might be such a moment that might open the door for a different way of both studying history and actually living up to our past. But anyway, Yuval, your turn.
Well, I mean, I just love what Cannupa just said, and I would just maybe like to add, to call it a success means we've reached the end of of a process. And I think that might be a narrow way of thinking about where we are, because we're on a continuum of an experience rather than at the end of an experience. And I recently read some Walt Whitman again, which gave me so much not just pleasure, but just a healthy reminder of some of the things that make this kind of American experiment have value. Whitman, like James Baldwin, they're both writers who believe that America has not realized itself, but it's very far from doing that and actually achieving that. And I think framed in that way, it can make you think about changing from maybe a more spectatorial approach to American history to something that could be more active in terms of, this is a history that's not done. And if we do the reckoning work that Cannupa was referring to, and it certainly was a big part of what Sweetland was all about, if we do that work, then maybe we can find ways to live together as different people that are living on the same land. But that reckoning has to be serious and it has to be deep. and it cannot be sugar-coated, and it needs to be with the removal of all of the myths of what America is that has propagated a certain form of domination for many years. And I think once that is truly taken down and removed, like the statues that we're seeing all around us, then I think there is a path forward for the kind of vision of a democratic society that Whitman, Baldwin, Dewey, all of these people have been propagating.
You know, it's so great that you mentioned Whitman. I also was thinking so much of the most famous line, I think, or one of the most famous line in Whitman, where he says, "I contain multitudes," and I was reminded of that extraordinary moment in Milosz in his Ars Poetica, where he says, "The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person, for our house is open. There are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will." And those guests, you invited so many guests under the tent that we can call Sweetland. And in a way that invitation hasn't yet been made let's say in the world of opera, and perhaps in the world of art, generally speaking. I was reminded by the article, which I imagine both of you read in the New York Times, the interviews that Zachary Wolf and Joshua Barone did for an article they called "Black Artists on How to Change Classical Music," and and that kind of bringing into major institutions diversity hasn't happened. How much does it need to happen in the world you both inhabit?
I mean, it's really hard to imagine opera being a viable art form if there isn't a serious effort to increase the diverse points of view that are represented in opera. I mean, I think that unless that really changes, and truly now with everything happening, again, I mentioned this earlier, but now it's such a no-brainer. Now it's such a vital necessity now. I mean, it always has been, and it's been something that has been potentially, it's been an uphill struggle, I think, for some people to realize how important this is for opera being an art form that actually does express the civic values that we are professing. But I think there's, after we, when we finally do go back to an opera house, if it goes back to normal,
whatever that means,
it just goes back to the old normal, I should say. If we return to the opera house and we see on stage what we saw before all of this happened, why would you ever go back? Why would you ever think that that's an art form that matters now? I wouldn't.
Is this something you're exploring, as you were saying, in a different rhetoric to approach the writing of your book?
It is. I'm thinking about it in terms of the book, of course, but I'm also thinking about it beyond just the theoretical level. I'm thinking about it in terms of action and in terms of what I can do, and what role I can play in making that happen. The industry is a small artist-led organization here in Los Angeles, and so we, I feel like a project like Sweetland or some of the other projects we've done, they sort of put pressure on opera from the outside, Right. But I have been thinking kind of along the lines of what Cannupa was saying. I've been thinking a lot about leadership in institutions. Is it the notion of an institution, or is it more about what it takes for leaders of our current institutions to really be advocating for the kind of change that, for me, feels so not just necessary, but quite honestly, easy. You know what I mean? It actually seems really easy.
It can be done.
Just do it.
It can be done. I mean, when you read the first paragraph of the article I was mentioning by Zachary Wolf and Joshua Barone, it begins with their major institution founded on white European models and obstinately focused on the distant past. Classical music and opera have been even slower than American society at large to confront racial inequity. Black players have made up less than 2% of the nation's orchestra, and the Metropolitan Opera still has yet to put on a work by a black composer. You read that, it's staggering. I mean, we know it all, but now it's what do you make of this, Zachary, and how can you in your own practice change your ways?
I think one of the things that's interesting in that conversation is, one, you're expressing both this idea of inevitability, right? Like the potential to return to what was is much further away than the far shore. You know, we've crossed over something that to return would be just as difficult as to go on, you know, stated in Macbeth. The idea of being dependent on these major institutions to finally recognize that is, I think, one of the challenges that I am most afraid of. To wait for them again to respond means that, you know, it'll take hundreds of years because these ships are brick and mortar and they easy. Artists themselves, creators, those within the field that are actually producing culture are nimble and are able to adapt to these variations and these changes. My big interest is how do we rather than put all of this effort and energy into changing these systems that were developed, whether that's dismantling or adapting to them. What I'm really interested in is how do we, as the nimble, as the quick, as the flexible, as the able to make change, how do we engage with one another and actually start to produce ideas without them? You know, like how do we make that exchange between people easier than having to go to the opera house in order to experience these things? That effort to travel to places to do that is in question right now. So how do we lean into accessibility and change the responsibility of the machine finally seeing us visible to actually being and creating to make the machine to come to us? You know, that's what I'm interested in.
Did you want to respond to that, Yuval, or did you want me to ask you another insightful question?
No, I love that, and I think that I have the feeling that is absolutely going to happen. As Cannupa said, you know, thinking of culture, it's you know, it's funny just because opera is so often seen as such a kind of an art form that's administered from above, you know, somehow everything about it is in relation to kind of aspirational imagery and deus ex machinas and all of these things. And so but I've been, certainly with the industry, have been trying to advocate for opera as an expression that comes from the ground up, you know, instead. And I do feel like in America, like our institutions are so much younger. I'm not ready to give up on the institutions of the opera house, I guess I should say, you know.
Not yet.
Just think that I'm not yet, I should say, exactly. But I yeah. You know, so I'm not ready to give up on that yet. I just think that if it doesn't change now, then I will not just me personally give up on it. I think American culture will just realize it's an art form that doesn't have anything to say to right now and to us. This is a very important moment, I think, for the art form to truly stand in the vision of what it can be.
I'd like to talk to you both about what you've been doing with your days as of recently. Yuval, you mentioned reading Walt Whitman. I think if I recall right, that was even before the pandemic that you were embarking on that journal. But recently, Yuval, I'll start with you. You've been reading, you said to me, there is no exam, I promise you, but you've been reading recently Richard Rorty. What speaks to you at this moment? Reading Richard Rorty. Why at this moment? Why now? What can he make you in a sense understand about this moment?
Well, Richard Rorty is, you know, a philosopher that's very much connected to a kind of postmodernist American philosopher, is very much connected to a kind of postmodern thinking, and I've had him on my shelf for a long time, and I've only read sort of small excerpts of him in college, and so I hadn't gone very deeply into his thinking. And, you know, of course, quarantining or, something resembling quarantining recently has given me the time to, to kind of undertake a kind of a deep thinking project like that in terms of an engagement with ideas. And I've been really, I have to say that one of the things that I really, really appreciate about the way that Rorty thinks, I've been questioning the entire postmodern enterprise since Trump. The notion of kind of alternative facts feels like the dark side of postmodernism. If everything is if everything is relative, if there's no possibility of one truth, what does that mean? What does that turn into? I think I grew up. When I was studying it seemed like an opportunity for incredibly positive new directions in society and thinking about society in new ways. But everything that's been happening in our government now has shown the flip side of what that could mean. So I've been questioning what a kind of postmodern worldview might be able to offer us today. So it's been actually refreshing to engage with Rorty, whose notion that just because there isn't a kind of end point of an ultimate truth, that can actually be aligned with progressive social values in very strong ways. The notion that actually instead of, he was advocating very strongly for kind of a post-philosophical worldview, that philosophy might have run its course, and maybe the way that we start to engage with each other and with the world is actually through reading and through literature, and that opportunity to put yourself in other people's shoes and experience the world from their point of view greatly changes our own. And
right.
I think one thing that I'm really appreciating about him is this notion that he's constantly talking about a redescription of yourself, that we are always, we can't ever finish the project of ourselves, that we are constantly being renewed, that reading a new book or engaging with a new conversation partner, Sweetland feels can be very closely connected to this, like,
right.
Working really closely with
right.
Cannupa on this has changed the way I view everything. It's changed the way it changed the way that I directed, certainly in that project. And I'm sure that the next time I'm directing a live production, it will bear the traces of that amazing encounter and that amazing collaboration. And that notion that we don't have a fixed vocabulary for understanding the world, but it's constantly being enriched with new points of view. I find that incredibly inspiring, and it gives me great hope in a time where I think hope is a dwindling commodity.
Right, and it's very interesting, putting yourself in other people's shoes, however uncomfortable those shoes may be. And
exactly.
Cannupa, I will end with you on a good note. What I hope. What has occupied you? I know of your Future Ancestral Technologies project, but take it wherever you would like to take it. We now know that Yuval is deeply immersed in Richard Rorty, bless his heart. What are you deeply immersed in, if it's something you can share with us?
I think prior to quarantine and the shift and social unrest and all of this sort of stuff, whatever prior means, as it's existing in a continuum. But as an artist working in the field, I had to travel so much. I was removed from home, and the economy of art and the exchanges that were made, the effort to participate in the mechanism that is the art market, removed me from why I was doing all of that work in the first place, which is to provide for my home and my family. And for me, within the last few months, being home reminded me why I was working so hard, and I lived to work hard, and I forgot why I was doing it. So there has been something really spectacular about being home. I'm the father of two little boys. They're 8 and 6. My partner, Ginger, I wasn't able to see them in all the ways that they are and watch them develop. And as children, they develop so quickly. And in an effort to provide for them the opportunity to develop, to learn, to be comfortable, to be taken care of, I was missing that, So there's been something really profound in me that's making me question why we do things, and the value of them. What's the cost of it versus the value. And I think as Yuval was stating, like, this conversation around the variation between truth and honesty is important. To experience somebody else and to have room for that to change is an honest exchange. I think as we were talking about colonialism and all of these other things, one of the greatest weapons that machine has brought to the world is the idea that everything is fixed, that everything is a noun. But I think maybe what Rorty was talking about was that everything in life is in flux. Nothing is. It's in the process of, and if we can exchange with one another and engage with one another, and even myself with my children and my family, and like the point and the purpose of home not being a noun, something that I've built, but is something that's in process and constantly growing. I think this is the way we should exchange with community and each other, rather than isolating, labeling, and putting away someplace. That act of flux is beautiful, and most of the universe, from my experience, is about the relationship and not about the minuscule particle that's creating the relationship, and I think that's important.
How wonderful. It reminds me of that wonderful line of Lawrence Stern, who said, "To define is to distrust." I can't thank you both enough.
Yeah, the more we try to describe something, the further from what it actually is true. It's interesting.
Yeah, so true.
I can't thank you both enough. Well, I can. I will thank you again and say thank you so much, Yuval. Thank you so much, Cannupa, for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. Stay safe. I, for one, will be very interested to see the difference this time has made in your work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Same.
Thank you so much. Be well. Stay safe.
You too, Paul. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and take care.
And see you before long. Bye-bye.
Hopefully, indeed. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.